The economic advantages, the cost advantages of an electric vehicle are now pretty significant. And therefore, even if you impose what will be a pretty modest per kilometre charge as a road user charge, even so, the total cost of ownership for an electric vehicle compares very, very favourably to a petrol vehicle. The fact is, it's not a new charge, as we've talked about, but in politics, perception is reality. And if a lot of people perceive it as a new charge, then you've got something that is challenging to explain.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to chat with me today.
Great to be with you, Emily.
I was hoping you could do an elevator pitch to introduce yourself, to like a 30-second kind of who is Paul?
Okay, former politician, 15 and a half years in the parliament, including several years as Minister for Urban Infrastructure. During that time, did a fair bit of work on transport policy issues, including, amongst other things, road user charging, arrival of electric vehicles, fuel efficiency standards, etc., etc. And more recently, I've been doing some work with you and your colleagues at Compass IoT, given the really interesting technology that you have developed and are implementing in relation to connected vehicles.
So I want to unpack quite a number of the things you've just mentioned, but I thought before we get into all the nitty-gritty that it would be really good to go back to the basics. So when we're kind of looking at building a road or maintaining a road, where does the money come from to do so? Most people, I think, actually have no idea that they're already paying for the maintenance and the uptake of roads.
Yeah, people are paying for roads. Most vehicles on the road are paying the fuel excise. If you're driving, say, a 15-year-old Commodore and you work through what you pay per litre and then how many kilometres you typically get in a car like that, you're ending up paying about 4.5 cents per kilometre through the fuel excise to use the roads. And just as a reminder, obviously fuel prices have been jumping up and down over the last few months with the war in the Middle East, but with fuel excise at its normal level, you're typically paying maybe $1.60, $1.80 per litre for your fuel. Of that, around 50 cents, it gets indexed, I think, every 6 months, but around 50 cents typically is the fuel excise. That was temporarily removed for a few months, and right now it's reduced, not back up to its normal full level, but you are paying quite a lot out of your fuel bill in the fuel excise. Of course, you're also paying through things like your registration charge and some other things, but those are the main direct means by which you pay. And then, of course, if you're on a toll road, you're paying a charge to the owners of the toll road, which might be a private company like Transurban, or it might be a state government like New South Wales government or Queensland government. So then where does the money for roads come from? The first thing is that both state governments and local governments operate and maintain roads. The major roads are state government roads, so the Pacific Highway in New South Wales, the Bruce Highway in Queensland. Then your local suburban roads will be the responsibility of your local council. So where I live on the North Shore of Sydney, Ku-ring-gai Council or Willoughby Council. And of course, in country areas, it will be typically a shire council. And in some parts of Australia, you've got local councils that might only have a few hundred ratepayers, and they will have thousands and thousands of kilometres of road because they cover a very big area. Okay, so several levels of government, lots and lots of roads to maintain. How does it actually work? Who pays for it? So for the major roads, the direct responsibility sits with state government entities like Transport for New South Wales or Transport and Main Roads in Queensland. Then you've got local councils which maintain most of the roads by number. Then, of course, you've got the Commonwealth government, which is typically spending order of magnitude $10 billion a year or more that is going into road and rail funding. So I was Minister for Urban Infrastructure for several years. Each year we would work out how much money was going to particular projects. So during the time I was Minister, some of the big projects around Australia were, say, the North-South Corridor in Adelaide, WestConnex in Sydney, a whole bunch of different projects in Perth, upgrades to the M1, the Pacific Motorway from the Gold Coast to Brisbane. And each of those would get big chunks of money. It might be 300 million here or $1 billion there, sometimes more, as well as a whole series of other grants that go from the Commonwealth to state governments. If you're wanting to kind of get a little reminder of how Australia's political system works, after the budget, listen out for state transport ministers complaining that they've been dudded by the Commonwealth and that they didn't get enough money and their state should have got more. That is a ritual that happens every year after both the budget and then what's called MYEFA, mid-year economic and fiscal outlook. Anyway, in short, 3 levels of government, each of them contributes to the funding of roads. 2 levels of government maintain and build roads, that's local and state, and it costs a lot of money to build and maintain the roads that we all use and take for granted every day.
You've kind of mentioned or alluded to this, that this topic has been in the media a lot recently because of a couple of reasons. We had the war that's happening again in the Middle East. You've got the electric cars, and then related to and somewhat adjacent to the temporary cost of living kind of attempt to reduce the cost of living pressures by reducing temporarily the fuel excise. I think there's a bit of like a fear factor, particularly around when people hear road user charging, because they often also hear this is another tax that I'm now going to have to pay for. It's a new thing. Your framing is that road user charging isn't a new tax, but is just an old one that's being made more visible or in a different form. Are you able to make this case plainly? So how is this just an existing excise by another name, and why has it maybe gone unnoticed for so long?
Just about all of us, until very recently, were paying to use our roads principally through the fuel excise. We didn't actually notice it, and most of us still don't notice it. We pay our fuel bill every time we go to a servo, and included in that is quite a lot of money that goes to the federal government under the fuel excise and then gets distributed for a whole bunch of reasons, including a lot of it going then to spend on road maintenance and upgrades. So the federal government pays grants to state governments and also to local councils through what are called the financial assistance grants. Now, over the past few years, we've had the arrival of electric vehicles. That is broadly a very good thing. They're efficient. They're obviously not generating of carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, and increasingly, after quite a few years, they're now becoming very, very popular. And particularly this year, we have seen the sales numbers for electric vehicles really rocket ahead. And I think in the first 6 months of this year of 2026, total electric vehicle sales in Australia exceeded sales numbers for all of calendar 2025. So there's been a real explosion in electric vehicle take-up. That looks only likely to continue. But we do have a problem, because what that means is that an increasing number of vehicles on the road are not contributing towards the cost of maintaining and operating roads. First of all, that's not fair. It's not fair that if you're able to afford a Tesla, which might cost 60 or 70 or 80 grand, you can then avoid paying for the cost of roads. Whereas if you're driving a 15-year-old Commodore or whatever else it might be, you are hit with the cost of roads through what you pay on the fuel excise. But I think there's another really important issue here, which is how do we maintain our road system as the transition happens to electric vehicles? It's a desirable transition. It's happening now really with increasing speed. And what's important is that we are supporting that transition and that we are adjusting our overall system so that as the share of electric vehicles on the road increases, we've got a sustainable road system, including sustainable funding of the maintenance and upgrades that roads require. And so, in my view, to be talking about a road user charge, a way of directly charging vehicles on a per kilometre basis, so you are capturing electric vehicles, that's not about discouraging or blocking electric vehicles. It's about recognizing the inevitability and desirability of their take up and making sure that we've got our system set up so that as electric vehicles become more and more of the total fleet, that we've got a system which is adjusted and optimized for that. And by the way, one of the things that I have argued for in a number of public forums, particularly since I ceased being a politician, but I did say it before, was that one thing that money raised through a road user charge on electric vehicles could very sensibly be used for in the early years is subsidizing the continued rollout of chargers, because we know that range anxiety is a thing. People are worried about, are there enough chargers? So if you take your electric vehicle on a long distance journey, are you going to be able to pull over, find a charging station and recharge? And therefore, the more that we can build out the network of electric chargers around the country, the more it will build confidence in people making that transition. But I think that's one example of the fact that we need to continue to build and develop our infrastructure, and therefore we need a system which recognizes and is optimized for the fact that the share of vehicles which are electric vehicles is going to keep rising. That's a good thing. We should encourage it and we should welcome it. And one of the ways to support that transition is to make sure that our system of funding roads is set up for the future.
So then I guess the question at the end of the day, is road user charging or RUC a new cost, or do you think it's just the same cost made visible?
It's absolutely the same cost. You know, as a politician and, as a Liberal MP, so coming from a side of politics which always argues to have tax levels as low as possible, but what you also want to do is make sure your taxes are fairly designed. So if you've got a tax system where there's a tax that applies to everybody, except that a small proportion of people are able to buy a newer technology device that lets them avoid paying tax, that's a fairness problem, and you need to update the design of your tax so that it falls across everybody on an equal basis, and that lets you keep the tax as low as possible. The worst thing is to have a tax system that's unfair, where the tax is charged on some people but not on others, and some people are effectively able to get out of paying what other people pay. Now, I hasten to add, I'm not in any sense critical of people who own electric vehicles, not at all. It's people have bought vehicles under a system and they've operated accordingly. What I am saying is that it is desirable that our tax design be updated so that the tax that is charged to people driving cars and using roads applies fairly to all, regardless of the particular technology of the vehicle that you're using.
So you are no longer a minister, but when you were a minister, you, as you've mentioned, you did try to push for road user charging. How did that go, and how do you think it's different now?
Well, it didn't go so well. For a period from about 2015 to about 2017, I pushed quite hard to get this issue on the agenda. But there were a few things that meant at the time the political system was really not ready for it. The level of awareness of fuel excise, I think, was even lower then than it is now. The Australian Automobile Association did a survey in about 2014 or 2015, which said that roughly a third of people didn't know they paid fuel excise and another third knew but didn't know what the rate was. So therefore, when you were making the argument about fairness, it was a bit hard because people were worried that you were somehow talking about a new tax, because a lot of people didn't realize they're already paying it. Then one of the other complications was that people would say, well, this new road user charge, that's going to hit hardest people in outer suburban areas and people in the country because they're driving longer kilometres. Actually, on the contrary, those are the people who are paying the most now, and they're the ones who are most relatively disadvantaged if a new group comes along that gets a free pass and doesn't have to pay towards the cost of using our roads. But again, that was something that was not very well understood at the time. I think 10 years or so later, first of all, there is more awareness of these issues. For example, the Victorian government sought to introduce a charge on electric vehicles about 4 or 5 years ago. It was subsequently the subject of a legal challenge in the High Court, and the High Court overruled it. The New South Wales government has a legislation to introduce a charge on electric vehicles, a per kilometre charge, with effect from 2027, 1 July 2027, I think it is. So there's more awareness because of those measures. There's more awareness because the proportion of people with electric vehicles is now rising sharply. And I think the other thing that's happened is that some political representatives of people in outer suburban areas and country areas had dug into this issue a bit more and have started to make the case that, look, the present system is unfair to the people I represent if they have to pay through the fuel excise a road user charge today, but other people are not paying. And so fairness really demands that everybody should pay.
It seems like we cannot avoid it, but this whole thing does kind of land right in the middle of the EV or the electric vehicles conversation. So as more people switch to electric or hybrid vehicles, they then start paying less fuel tax because they can use a hybrid kind of or HPEV model, or they stop paying it altogether because they buy, like you alluded to, a BYD or a Tesla or a Geely or any of those fully electric models. Is that a fairness problem, or is it just the price of encouraging electric vehicles? Why might that even be a problem at all?
I don't think it's a problem at all that more and more people are buying electric vehicles. I think it's a very good thing. And I think we've arrived now at that point in Australia with 2026 really feeling like an inflection point that many of us have been waiting for quite a long time. And it reflects, I think, a whole range of factors. Clearly, the big jump in petrol prices this year because of the war in the Middle East has driven a lot of Australians to go and have a look at what's available in the electric vehicle market. And suddenly that people have realised, you know what, there are vehicles now for under $40,000, whereas even 2 years ago, it was very hard to find anything under about $60,000 or $70,000. So that's definitely been a factor. And of course, the more people who have an electric vehicle, the more likely that the rest of us will know somebody with one, we'll hear some feedback about it, we'll hear people say, yeah, it's great, and it's the range anxiety is really overrated. When you think about it, on average, most people drive, say, 30, 50, 70 kilometers a day at most. It's not really a problem, etc., etc. The argument that you hear from some is anything which makes the economic advantages of an electric vehicle less powerful should be pushed back on because it'll discourage people from acquiring an electric vehicle, and we really need to encourage take up. My answer to that would be, when you sit down and look at the numbers and compare what you're paying effectively per kilometre for a petrol vehicle or a diesel vehicle, and then compare it to what you're paying per kilometre for an electric vehicle, there's a big advantage with electric vehicles. There's an advantage even if you do all your charging at public charging stations, which are order of magnitude, 60 odd cents plus or minus per kilowatt hour. If you're lucky enough to have to be in a situation where you can charge at home, and particularly if you've got solar panels, you can get your average per kilowatt hour price down well below that. So there are very strong economic advantages in buying and operating an electric vehicle. For several years, the standard advice has been, total cost of ownership for an electric vehicle looks pretty good compared to a petrol vehicle, but most of us only think about the upfront purchase price, and electric vehicles are still much more expensive than petrol vehicles. We know that has really changed in about the last 12 or 18 months. So long-winded way of saying the economic advantages, the cost advantages of an electric vehicle are now pretty significant. And therefore, even if you impose what will be a pretty modest per kilometre charge as a road user charge, even so, the total cost of ownership for an electric vehicle compares very, very favourably to a petrol vehicle.
What if we if we did devil's advocate? So what if we pushed back on the whole idea and we said, okay, why not just lift fuel excise or lift regos and kind of incorporate it in there and just be done with the whole thing? Why might like a distance-based charge give us, or what might a distance-based charge give us that maybe those blunt kind of increases don't give us?
Well, I think first of all, on fairness grounds, anything that government spends money on, you can, if you choose, pay for it just out of general tax revenue. But the problem is there's so much that has to be paid for out of general tax revenue that there are real advantages if there are things that you can legitimately separately charge for and pay for out of activities that directly take advantage of that particular government expenditure. In this case, the government expenditure on building and maintaining roads and all of the associated services like the cost of highway patrol and random breath test and all those things that keep us safer. We might not like them necessarily, but they're very important. They keep us safe, but they cost money. So, traditionally, this has been charged for with a mix of, in the economic jargon, a fixed charge, namely registration, several $100s a year, plus a variable charge. And the variable charge has been given effect to with the per litre fuel excise, because the amount of litres that you use is directly proportional to the distance you travel. However, if it were possible to efficiently and conveniently track the number of kilometres that you use, then that gives the option of charging for your use of the road based on the number of kilometres. Now, there's a real fairness appeal to that. If you travel only 1,000 kilometres a year, then intuitively it seems fair that you would pay less than if you travel 5,000 kilometres a year or 10,000 or 50,000. Now, there are other factors besides distance. When it comes to heavy vehicles, the charging formula that you hear repeatedly used is mass, distance, location. And part of the reason for that is that heavy vehicles disproportionately impose a load on roads and create a maintenance burden. In other words, a typical light vehicle, typical car might be 1 tonne, 1.5, 2 tonnes. The heavy vehicle could be 20 or 30 tonnes. It will impose more than 30 times as much of a load, and so it's fair to recover a greater cost. But anyway, putting aside technicalities like that, in principle, imposing a charge which is proportionate to the distance you travel is intuitively appealing based on fairness considerations. Now, there are some other things to think about, namely people in the country typically travel longer distances than people in cities. Ought there to be some way of taking account of that? That's definitely an argument you could make. One of the things that is interesting today is that with technology like that, which, for example, Compass IoT can offer, it does mean that you can look at different options. It's less burdensome for an individual driver to, for example, record distance. One of the advantages of fuel excise is there's nothing separate you have to do. You're already going to be buying petrol. You're paying a price for the petrol, and that includes the tax. And the amount of petrol you use is proportionate to the distance you drive. In countries that have had a road user charge system for some time, and one of the standout examples is New Zealand, it's been a fairly clunky process because what you have to do is buy a prepaid voucher for, I think, 1,000 kilometres. I think you're required to stick it on your windshield or
Yep.
similar. And so that's a bit of hassle for a user. That's been the way things operate in New Zealand. People have got used to it, but it's not as convenient as just refueling your car, and the payment of what you pay for using the road gets taken care of as part of that process. But in a connected vehicle world, actually, it could be a lot quicker and more convenient and more efficient to be able to track the distance that you've traveled and work out what you need to be charged without having to do anything involving filling out vouchers and turning up to a shop and buying prepaid vouchers and all that kind of stuff.
I want to double click on the connected vehicle things, but first the thing that keeps coming up in a lot of the discussion is this idea of fairness or equity featuring quite heavily. If it is a fair or a more fair and a more equitable system, why do governments keep backing away from it?
I think the principal reason that governments had been wary of introducing a direct per kilometre road user charge is that they are worried, or they have historically been worried about the idea that people will see this as a new charge.
Mm.
The fact is it's not a new charge, as we've talked about, but in politics, perception is reality. And if a lot of people perceive it as a new charge, then you've got something that is challenging to explain. I think the other reason governments have been have not moved further on this is because until recently, both the fairness issue and the issue of how we're going to keep getting enough money to build and maintain roads were not immediately pressing, because the percentage of electric vehicles remain very, very small. When I was talking about this as a minister 10 years ago, that was certainly the case. But of course, things are now changing quite quickly. And so it probably is increasingly hard for government to keep ignoring this issue if governments want, as they should, to have a sustainable system for funding our roads. It's not going to advance anybody's interests if we have lots more electric vehicles, but our roads get more and more ratty because the amount of money to maintain them starts to erode.
You mentioned earlier that there's now new technologies like connected vehicles that are being brought into this conversation that maybe are also helping to facilitate these changes. So the technology does now exist to measure road use more accurately in a different format without someone having to kind of take their logbook down to the service centre to get it manually audited or anything like that. What can connected vehicle data do here that just wasn't physically possible 10 years ago?
You're absolutely right. The arrival of connected vehicles offers new options to collect a charge in a way that is much less burdensome and annoying for drivers, car owners. Most vehicles on the road since about 2018 now are shipped with a head unit, part of what the manufacturer builds into the vehicle, which has a SIM card in it and generates data that goes to the mobile network and then in turn into the cloud. And most manufacturers now use that data to offer owners of their vehicles enhanced services that you can access via an app that comes with the vehicle. But what it could also allow you as the owner to do, only with your permission and consent, I hasten to add, but it could allow you to say through a one-click process, well, I authorize the provision of a record of trips I've taken and distance elapsed, starting time, finishing time, and distance elapsed. And then that would be used to calculate a road user charge. And you could, if you were minded to, you could agree to that through a one-click process that might be, say, if it was done, if you're in New South Wales, it could be on the Transport for New South Wales website. But it could also offer some other options. If governments were interested in this, governments could say, you know what, we're also going to offer people the chance to pay their registration charge, not as a flat annual sum, but also on a per kilometre basis. So it could be a graduated thing. There could be people who could find that, a lot less burdensome. But the simple point is, because a lot of vehicles are now connected vehicles, it offers an option for people to be paying a charge in a way that doesn't involve having to buy prepaid vouchers, or even having to do something as clunky as take a photo of your odometer at the start of the year and at the end of the year, which was in fact how the Victorian distance-based charge for electric vehicles was. That was what the plan was before it was successfully challenged in court. And you mentioned earlier the idea of having to take a logbook to a garage. Actually, in Britain, they've been consulting on something called the EVED, the Electric Vehicle Excise Duty, which again is a policy commitment that was in the last budget that was brought down in the UK, that there would be a per kilometre charge on electric vehicles, again, for the fairness reasons that we were talking about earlier. But in a consultation document that the British government put out, they were proposing that people would have to get this checked as part of what they call their MOT, I think, which is the annual vehicle, the equivalent of the green slip in New South Wales. That seems like a very clunky and inefficient process. And in a connected vehicle world, it's a completely unnecessary process. By the way, there's one other point to make, which is privacy is absolutely critical in all these things. And you can very readily set this up so that the data that would get supplied for the purpose of calculating how much you get charged would be date of trip, start of trip, end of trip. So time to start the trip, time at which the trip started, time at which it ended, and elapsed distance, but nothing else. It would not provide location. You could very easily set it up that way, and you could have that independently verified by an agency or an oversight mechanism. I think these things will be important because people are naturally concerned about privacy considerations. But the key point is you can definitely find ways to address those.
So I suspect you aren't racing to get back into politics. But if you were considering advising the government today, what would you say is like a good first step in the right direction? Would it be a pilot, public conversation, or are like hard deadlines more of a thing? What do you think might break the cycle of stalling?
I think there's a couple of things. First of all, it's clear that New South Wales government is planning to proceed with its implementation of this and then wait and see whether anybody mounts a legal challenge. But the thing that I would advocate, be it to New South Wales government, be it to federal government, be it to any other government, state or federal in Australia or indeed elsewhere in the world that's thinking about this, is do think very carefully about the user experience. If you look at the work that was done by the previous New South Wales government on the citizen experience in the digital age, the work that Victor Dominello led as Minister for Customer Service. People previously thought the idea of having a good customer service experience with government was just an impossible idea, unheard of. The idea that what you experienced if you went to go and renew your license or your vehicle registration, that could be a smooth, pleasant experience, that was unheard of. But the New South Wales government, and under Victor Domino's leadership and with strong backing, particularly from Gladys Berejiklian when she was Premier, put a lot of effort into making that citizen experience, that customer experience, as smooth as possible, including being able to do as much digitally as possible. So wherever possible, you didn't have to go in to a counter, to shop front, but you could do it all online. I think it would be worth really focusing on what is going to be, if we are going to charge people on a per kilometre basis as a substitute for being charged through paying the fuel excise, how do we make that experience as frictionless as possible? And can it be a one-click experience? Can you be able to, would it be possible for me as the owner of an electric vehicle to go onto the Transport for New South Wales website or the equivalent website of analogous agencies in other states and essentially get a confirmation that my vehicle was a connected vehicle? And by the way, almost every electric vehicle is a connected vehicle. But with that, then be given the option, click here to pay your road user charge using your connected vehicle capability. I think a lot of people would find that to be a pretty convenient option. And therefore, I think it would be wise for governments to be running a trial so that customer service experience could be tested. And I think you could test some other things. So in New South Wales, in Australia, where we have states and state borders, using connected vehicle technology to collect a road user charge would immediately deal with the problem of, okay, I live in Albury, but every day I drive to Wodonga for work, because it can automatically work out which part of the trip is in New South Wales, which part is in Victoria. Or another situation which often comes up, and this has been quite big in New Zealand with their road user charge, which they've had for many years. If you own a farm and a lot of your driving is on a farm road, then each year you have the painful process of having to claim back some of what you've paid in the road user charge by demonstrating, well, actually, I did 14,000 kilometres this year, but 3,500 were on road, on my own farm, so I shouldn't have to pay for that. All of that can be handled in a very smooth, efficient, frictionless manner using connected vehicle technology, and that gives a much better end user experience. So my number one recommendation to government would be do some trials where, amongst other things, you can test out what the user experience is, because that'll demonstrate that actually the user experience could be pretty frictionless. I mean, nobody likes having to pay a tax, but what's even more annoying, on top of having to pay a tax, is when it's a clunky, inconvenient process to do it. So if it could be made a frictionless customer experience, then that would be a good thing. And I'd encourage governments to test out how that could be done and look at the use of connected vehicle technology to achieve that outcome.
It does feel that we're increasingly kind of at a bit more of a crossroads than maybe we were about 5, even 10 years ago. And so I thought it would be interesting as a thought experiment to paint two futures. So what happens if we act on this in the next few years versus if we continue to kind of maybe continue at the same pace we are, or keep kicking the can down the road, so to speak?
Well, I think if we do keep kicking the can down the road, we're going to see a increasingly rapid reduction in the revenue stream that comes from fuel excise, and that will increasingly squeeze the amount of money that's available to maintain existing roads and build new roads. I think we'll also probably start to see more and more of a broader community perception that this is quite unfair, because increasingly it'll be people driving older cars people who are less well off who will be paying the fuel excise, and people who are better off won't be paying it. And that's not good for social cohesion. It's not good for people's perceptions of fairness. On the other hand, if we make this change sooner rather than later, first of all, I think people will see, this is actually pretty convenient using connected vehicle technology and taking advantage of the fact that electric vehicles are almost all also connected vehicles. So this is just as the technology underpinning the vehicle that I'm driving is very modern and efficient, so is the particular mechanism that I'm using to pay this particular charge. Secondly, I think we'll see that some of the money that gets raised is likely to get allocated to helping build out the charger infrastructure and helping build confidence and drive the transition and attract more people to using electric vehicles. Thirdly, I think once we transition to this and get this new mechanism in place, I think we'll actually conclude this was all a bit of a storm in a teacup. Why were people in such a tiz about this? It's just pretty sensible, so I'm glad we did it.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for your time chatting on the podcast today.
It's been a pleasure, Emily. Really interesting issues and great to chat.
To learn more about any of the guests that we have on the Bite Size podcast, you can check out our show notes at compassiot.substack.com. Alternatively, if you'd like to know more about the company that runs this podcast, Compass IoT, you can visit our website, which is compassiot.com.au. Until next time.